Close your eyes and imagine a sky. Not the soft, familiar one you might know, with its steady stars twinkling like whispered secrets and a gentle moon cradling the night in a silver embrace, but a fractured, fading shroud where lights flicker out like the last trembling gasps of a dying ember, swallowed whole by an endless, suffocating dark that presses in with cold, relentless fingers. This is the universe in its final, shivering breaths, a cosmos unraveling, thread by fragile, aching thread, stretched beyond its breaking point by forces we can't name, can't fight, can't even fully grasp. A slow, merciless collapse that steals the light and leaves only shadows, only silence, only despair in its wake. My name is Alara, and this is my story. Ours. A tale of the last signal I sent into the void. A quivering cry from a world that was crumbling beneath my feet, carrying a hope so thin it sliced through me like a jagged blade through fragile flesh. Yet so fierce it held me together when everything I loved was torn away. When the silence roared louder than my screams, leaving me bleeding, broken, and alone in its cruel grip. It's about a father whose voice still echoes in my shattered heart. A love that clawed its way across a dying abyss to find me when I thought I'd lost it all. And a fight to scream into a silence that hungered to erase us, to grind us into dust and scatter us across a forgotten void until we were nothing but whispers, on a wind that no longer blows, nothing but echoes no one would hear. It begins on Arctura, my home, a cracked, dusty planet orbiting a star too weak to warm us, too tired to fight the cold that seeped into our bones, into our souls, and with a sound, a faint, desperate crackle in the night, that ripped me apart, poured salt into wounds I didn't know I could bear, and somehow, against all odds, stitched me back together with a thread of something I'd lost long ago. Hope, fragile and trembling, but alive, burning against the dark. I was born on a night when the wind carried ash instead of dreams, a cold, bitter whisper that seeped through the cracks of the dome that sheltered us, a fragile shell against a world that had already begun to forget us, a world that had turned its back long before I took my first breath. Arctura was a small, brittle place, a husk of rock and faded memory circling a red dwarf that glowed dimly, a wary ember clinging to life more out of habit than strength. Its light too weak to chase away the shadows that clung to everything, too faint to warm the air that bit at our lungs with every inhale, leaving a taste of rust and sorrow behind. The air was sharp, laced with the acrid tang of decay, a bitterness that settled on your tongue and lingered like a memory you couldn't shake, a reminder of what we'd lost, and the ground beneath us split and groaned with every step, as if it longed to surrender, to collapse into itself and be done with the struggle of holding us up. They called it the Great Fade, the slow, merciless drift of the universe toward oblivion, a creeping death that stole the light from the heavens, a thief in the night that left us grasping at shadows, clutching at ghosts. Galaxies slipped beyond our sight, drifting into an unreachable distance like ships lost to a fog that never lifts. Stars dimmed and vanished one by one, their glow snuffed out like candles in a storm we couldn't shelter from, their absence a weight that pressed down on us, and an unseen force, dark energy. They whispered in hushed, fearful tones, as if naming it might summon it closer, stretch space until it creaked like a ship caught in a tempest, its timbers cracking under the strain, its hull groaning as it splintered apart, its pieces drifting away into nothing. I never knew the universe in its glory days, when it blazed with light and promise, when it sang with the hum of creation and the chatter of countless worlds, when it held life in its arms instead of crushing it. But my father, Kale, carried its memory like a wound he couldn't close. A scar etched deep into his soul that bled every time he looked up, every time he saw the emptiness where beauty had once been. He was an astronomer, one of the last of his kind, with hands roughened by years of mending broken machines, fingers calloused and scarred from a lifetime of fighting to keep the past alive, to keep the stars from fading entirely, and eyes that held a quiet, endless sorrow, as if he could still see the stars that had abandoned us, their ghosts haunting him even in the dark, staring back at him from a sky that no longer cared, a sky that had turned cold and silent. Our home was a dome perched on a windswept hill, pieced together from scavenged steel and stubborn hope. Its walls patched with whatever we could find, sheets of rusted metal, strips of faded cloth, anything to hold back the wind, overlooking a valley where grey, stunted fields fought a losing battle against the encroaching dust, their roots clawing at a soil that offered nothing but despair, a barren cradle for a people who'd forgotten how to dream, a graveyard for the life we'd once had. Beside it stood the signal dish, a towering relic of rusted metal, its curves pitted and worn by time and neglect, its frame bent but unbowed, still reaching upward, defiant, like a hand grasping for something long lost. A silent prayer cast into a sky that no longer answered. A monument to a hope that refused to die even as the world around it crumbled into ash. Father was my entire world. My light in a darkness that grew thicker with every passing year. My anchor when the ground beneath us trembled and threatened to give way. My sky when the heavens turned their back and left us to the void. My everything when I had nothing else. He had a voice like a warm wind through a forgotten forest, deep and steady. A melody that wove tales of a time when the universe danced with fire and song. When the stars were more than fading memories, when they were friends, guardians. A family watching over us from above, a comfort in the night. Every night, he'd lead me to the observatory, a cramped shack clinging to the dish's base like a barnacle on a sinking ship. Its walls papered with star charts yellowed by time and despair, their edges curling inward like petals wilting, ink faded from years of longing, smudged by the touch of his hands as he traced them, as he held onto them. "Look up, Ilara," he'd say, his graying beard catching the faint, flickering glow of the console as he traced the heavens with a trembling finger, his hand steady despite the shake in his voice, despite the weight of a lifetime pressing down on him, a weight he carried for me. That's where the Pleiades once shone, 7 sisters, bright as hope, fierce as warriors, a constellation that lit the night. Now they're just whispers in the dark, ghosts of a sky we've lost, but they're still there, somewhere, waiting for us to find them again. I'd press my face to the dusty glass, my breath fogging it in small, fleeting clouds, trying to see through his eyes, to catch a glimpse of the wonder he held onto so tightly. My small hand swallowed in his calloused grip, warm and rough against my skin. A lifeline I didn't know I'd need, a touch I'd cling to in the years to come. I was 4 when he first lifted me onto his lap, his arms wrapping around me like a shield against the cold, guiding my tiny fingers to the controls with a tenderness that belied the weight he carried. His heartbeat steady against my back, a rhythm I'd memorize without knowing it. The dish hummed beneath them, a low, living pulse that sang to me, vibrating through my bones. A sound that felt like life itself. Like a promise whispered in a language I couldn't yet speak. A connection I felt deep in my core. "This is how we speak to the stars," he murmured, his breath warm against my cheek, his voice thick with a longing I couldn't yet grasp, a yearning that seeped into me even then, planting roots I wouldn't feel until later, seeds that would grow in the dark. Long ago, before the fade stole it all, we sent messages, songs from Earth, laughter, pleas for connection, hoping someone, somewhere, would hear us, would know we were here, would answer our call. I'd giggle, my childish imagination painting pictures of aliens with big ears and funny voices catching our words like butterflies in a net, my heart light with wonder, untouched by the sorrow that shadowed him, blind to the pain that hid behind his smile, ignorant of the weight behind his words. "Are they still out there, Papa?" I'd ask, my voice a chirp of innocence cutting through the quiet, my eyes wide with the thrill of possibility, my small body bouncing with excitement, my world bright with the magic he spun for me. He'd smile, but it was a fragile, broken thing, shadowed with a doubt he couldn't hide. A crack in the strength he showed me, a flicker of fear he buried deep so I wouldn't see it. I hope so, my little star, he'd say, his hand brushing my hair, his fingers lingering as if he could hold onto me forever, as if he knew time was slipping away, as if he could shield me from what was coming. I hope so. Life on Arctura was a fragile thread, woven from grit, memory, and the stubborn will to endure despite the odds stacking higher with every dawn. A tapestry fraying at the edges but held together by sheer defiance. We grew crops under artificial suns, hulking, buzzing lamps that cast a cold, pale light over rows of wilted stalks, their hum a constant, grating reminder of what we'd lost. A mechanical heartbeat struggling to mimic a sun that had faded into a ghost of itself, their light flickering like a promise they couldn't keep, casting long shadows that danced across the fields. Water came from wells we dug deeper each year, their walls caked with the dust of our desperation, the buckets heavier with every haul, the liquid inside murky and scarce, tasting of metal and defeat, a bitter swallow that reminded us how little we had left, how much we'd given up. Our settlement was a patchwork of domes and tunnels. A few hundred souls clinging to survival. Farmers who cursed the barren soil with every failed harvest, their voices rough with frustration as they pounded the earth with fists and tools. Their hands stained with dirt and despair. Tinkerers who patched our crumbling machines with shaking hands. Their fingers stained with grease and hopelessness, their eyes hollow with the weight of keeping us alive, their breaths heavy with exhaustion, and elders who gathered by the communal fire pit, their voices trembling as they spun tales of earth, a lost paradise of blue seas that stretched to the horizon, rolling green hills that breathed with life, and skies that didn't fade into a suffocating black. Their words a lifeline to a past we'd never reclaim. A dream we couldn't touch. Father stood apart from them all, a solitary figure in a world that had given up dreaming, a man who refused to let go, who refused to bow. He didn't plant seeds or mend pipes, he listened. He'd spend hours at the dish, his fingers twisting dials with a precision born of obsession, his eyes scanning frequencies for echoes that never came, his breath held as if the next moment might bring the answer he'd sought his whole life. The proof he needed that we weren't alone, that we still mattered. They're out there, he'd tell me, his voice firm despite the emptiness stretching above us, his conviction a rock I clung to when the doubts crept in, a beacon that guided me through the dark when the light failed. Other worlds, other voices, we just have to find them, Elara. We have to let them know we're here, that we haven't given up. I'd nod, my faith in him unshaken, even as the elders shook their heads and muttered he was chasing phantoms. A madman lost in a sky that had turned its back on us. Their pity a bitter taste I learned to swallow. Their whispers a noise I tuned out for the sound of his certainty. For the strength in his eyes that told me we could still be heard. By the time I was 8, the fade had sunk its claws deeper into our lives. A relentless thief stealing what little we had left. A shadow that grew with every sunrise, darkening the edges of our world. The river that once wound through the valley, a thin, silver thread where I'd splash with father, shrieking with delight as he scooped me up and spun me around until the world blurred into a kaleidoscope of light and laughter. My voice ringing out in peals of joy, had dried to a jagged scar of dust, its banks crumbling like forgotten promises. The sound of its trickle a memory that haunted my dreams, a ghost that slipped through my fingers when I reached for it. A loss that echoed in the quiet. The artificial suns dimmed, their buzz faltering into a weak, stuttering gasp, casting long, flickering shadows over fields that shrank with every season, their stalks brittle and gray, snapping under the lightest touch like bones too fragile to hold. And the stars, Father's beloved stars, the ones he'd named for me, the ones he'd pointed to with a smile that lit up his face, shrank to a scattering of lonely pinpricks against a vast, uncaring black, their light too faint to pierce the gloom, too weak to offer the comfort I'd once found in them. too distant to feel like home anymore. People began to leave, some burrowing into Arctura's crust like moles fleeing a dying surface. Their tools clanging as they carved out new homes in the dark, their voices echoing faintly as they descended into the shadows. Others chasing whispered rumors of distant colonies that might still hold light, their footsteps fading into the dust, their shadows swallowed by the horizon. Their hope a flicker I couldn't follow, but father wouldn't budge, wouldn't bend, wouldn't break, wouldn't let go of the dream that kept him alive. The dish stays, he'd say, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with a fire I didn't fully understand, a determination that rooted him to that hill like the steel he tended, unyielding even as the world crumbled around us, even as the ground shook beneath his feet. It's our voice, Elara. Without it, we're nothing but dust waiting to be forgotten. Scattered and lost, erased from a universe that doesn't care, that won't remember. I'd sit with him in the observatory, the night pressing against the walls like a living thing, heavy and cold, my legs swinging from a stool too tall for me, my small hands resting on the edge of the console as he taught me the craft that defined him, that would one day define me, his legacy seeping into me with every word, every touch. This knob adjusts the range, he'd explain, guiding my hand with a gentleness that belied his strength. His touch steadying my clumsy fingers as they fumbled over the dials, learning their secrets, feeling their power. This one amplifies the signal, makes it loud enough to pierce the dark, to reach beyond what we can see, to touch the stars we've lost, to call them back. One day, this'll be yours, my star. I'd laugh, my voice echoing in the small space, thinking it was a game we played. A ritual of love between us, a moment I could hold onto forever, a bond that nothing could break, but his gaze was heavy, fixed on a future I couldn't yet see, a weight I didn't know I'd carry, a legacy he was entrusting to me with every lesson, every quiet moment we shared, every glance that told me he believed in me. The night he died, I was 15, and the world I'd built around him shattered into pieces I couldn't mend. A collapse that left me gasping in its wreckage, a wound that bled without end, a loss that carved me hollow. It began with a storm, a rare, savage beast conjured by a sun flare and a thinning atmosphere, a fury we hadn't seen in years, a tempest that roared out of the dark like a nightmare given form, tearing through our fragile existence with claws of wind and fire that ripped at everything we'd built. The wind screamed like a wounded animal, a primal howl that shook the dome to its bones, tearing at its edges with a ferocity that bent steel like paper caught in a child's fist, splintering glass into shards that bit the air, scattering across the floor in a glittering chaos that caught the flickering light. Father was in the observatory, recalibrating the dish after a power spike had scrambled its circuits, his silhouette a shadow against the console's faint, flickering glow, his hands moving with that familiar precision even as the world shook around him, his focus unbroken by the chaos outside, his mind on the stars he loved. I was inside the dome, stitching a torn blanket by the weak light of a lamp, my fingers fumbling with the needle, my mind drifting to the stories he'd told me. The warmth of his voice a comfort against the growing storm that rattled the walls. When I heard it, a groan of metal, deep and guttural, a sound that sank into my bones like a warning I couldn't heed, followed by a crash that shook the earth beneath me, a jolt that sent the needle slipping from my grasp, clattering to the floor with a sound that echoed in my skull. My heart seized, a cold fist closing around it, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. A terror I hadn't known I could feel flooding through me like ice through my veins, and I dropped everything, running into the chaos, my bare feet pounding the cracked floor, the storm blinding me with dust that stung like needles against my skin, my eyes watering as I fought to see, my breath hitching in my chest, my voice already breaking with a scream I couldn't hold back. The observatory's roof had collapsed, a jagged beam pinning him to the floor, his chest crushed beneath its weight, blood pooling dark and thick around him, soaking into the cracked concrete, spreading like a shadow that swallowed the light. A stain that marked the end of everything I knew, everything I loved. "Papa," I screamed, my voice raw, tearing from my throat as I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands clawing at the rubble, frantic, desperate, a wild thing driven by fear and love, by a need to save him that burned through me. My nails split, my fingers bled, staining the debris red as I dug, sobbing his name into the wind, my cries lost in the howl, my body shaking with a terror that consumed me, a desperation to pull him free, to hold on to him when the world was ripping him away, to keep him with me when I knew, deep down, he was already gone. His face was pale, his breaths shallow and ragged, wet with the sound of breaking, a gurgle that twisted my stomach into knots. But his eyes found mine, clouded with pain, yet still holding that flicker of love I'd always known, a light that refused to fade even now, even as he slipped away, a light that broke me more than the storm ever could. "Ilara," he rasped, his hand trembling as it reached for mine, slick with blood. His fingers cold and weak against my skin, slipping as he tried to hold on, his strength draining with every labored breath, every fading beat. "Keep it going. Send the signal. Promise me." Tears choked me, streaming hot down my face, my chest heaving with sobs that felt like they'd crack me open, my vision blurring as I gripped his hand, clinging to him with everything I had. My fingers slick with his blood, my heart breaking under the weight of his words. Under the weight of losing him. "I promise, Papa," I sobbed, my voice breaking, barely audible over the storm's roar. My words a plea, a vow, a desperate grasp at the life slipping away from me. A cry against the dark that was taking him from me. His fingers tightened around mine, a fleeting spark of strength, a last gift. A final touch that burned into my memory, then fell limp, his grip slipping away, his hand heavy in mine, lifeless, cold, gone. His gaze drifted past me, upward to a sky he'd loved more than life, a sky he'd fought to reach, a sky that had betrayed him, and he was gone, leaving me alone in the wreckage, my screams swallowed by the wind as the last star above us blinked out into nothingness, a void that matched the one opening inside me, a hole that swallowed my voice, my breath, my everything, a darkness that claimed me as surely as it had claimed him. I don't know how I pulled him free, only the weight of his body, limp and heavy in my arms, a burden that dragged me to the ground as I held him, rocking back and forth, my tears mixing with the dust that coated us both, my voice a broken wail that echoed in the emptiness, a sound of pure, unfiltered grief that tore through me like a blade, that left me raw and bleeding. The storm passed, leaving a silence thicker than death, a void that pressed against my ears, my heart, my lungs, stealing the air I needed to breathe, wrapping me in a stillness that felt like a shroud, like a grave closing over me. I buried him the next dawn behind the dome, under a slab of stone I carved with shaking, bloodied hands, Kale of Arctura, etched deep and crooked, the letters uneven from the sobs that racked me as I worked, my knees sinking into the dust, my fingers bleeding into the earth where he'd rest, my tears falling onto the stone like rain that couldn't wash away the pain, that couldn't bring him back. The settlement mourned, their voices a low hum of pity as they gathered briefly, their faces blurred through the haze of my tears, their hands reaching out only to fall away when I flinched, their presence a shadow I couldn't bear, a weight I couldn't carry alongside my own. They moved on, retreating to their tunnels, their whispered plans of survival a distant murmur I couldn't hear over the roar of my grief, over the silence he'd left behind, a silence that deafened me. I couldn't follow them, couldn't leave the hill, the dish, the promise that bound me to him, that chained me to this place. Grief was a blade, slicing me open, hollowing me out until I was a shell of the girl I'd been, a fragile thing trembling in the wind, my heart a raw, bleeding wound that pulsed with every breath, a pain that lived in me like a second heartbeat, but it also kindled a fire. A fierce, trembling flame I didn't know I had until it was all I had left. A spark born from the ashes of him. A light that refused to die even when I wanted to. Even when the weight of it crushed me. The dish was battered. Wires frayed and snapping in the breeze that followed the storm. Panels crumpled like paper crushed in a fist, bent and broken. But it was his legacy. His beating heart, and I wouldn't let it die with him. Wouldn't let his dream fade into the dust that claimed him. Wouldn't let the silence win when he'd fought so hard against it. I scavenged parts from abandoned domes, dragging heavy metal through the ash. My hands shaking with exhaustion, my lungs burning with every ragged breath. My body aching as I pushed past the pain, past the tears that blurred my vision, past the sobs that shook me. I pored over his manuals by the dim, flickering light of a failing lamp, my eyes stinging with tears and fatigue, my fingers trembling as I traced his handwriting, teaching myself his codes, his craft, my voice whispering his words back to him, for Alara, my star, scrawled in the margins. A message that broke me anew each time I read it, a promise he'd left me that I couldn't let go, that I couldn't betray. By 16, I'd patched it back together, the hum returning like a heartbeat, faint but alive. A sound that felt like him whispering to me through the dark. A lifeline in the silence that threatened to swallow me whole. A thread that held me when I thought I'd snap. Every night, I climbed the hill, my footsteps heavy, my body weary, my soul battered. Sat at the console, its weak light painting my tear-streaked face, illuminating the shadows of my loss. The lines of grief etched into my skin like a map of my pain, and spoke into the void. This is Alara of Arctura, I'd say, my voice small but steady, trembling with the weight of my promise, thick with the grief I carried like a second skin, a burden I couldn't shed. We're still here. We're still alive. I'd talk about him. His gentle hands that once lifted me to the stars. His stories of a sky I'd never see. The way he'd hum off key tunes to make me laugh until my sides ached. His voice a melody I'd never hear again. A sound I chased in the hum of the dish. A ghost I couldn't let go. Sometimes I'd sob, my voice cracking into the static. Tears dripping onto the controls, blurring the dials as I pressed on. My chest heaving with the weight of it all. The loss that lived in me. Sometimes I'd whisper memories just to hear them aloud, to keep him close. To feel him in the hum that filled the shack. To hold on to the love that anchored me when the world had torn him away. But I never stopped. Never faltered. Never gave in. It was my lifeline. My way of holding him when the universe had ripped him from me. A thread of sound tying me to the man who'd given me everything. The man whose absence was a wound that wouldn't heal. A scar that ached with every breath I took. Every beat of a heart that kept going when I didn't know why. The years stretched on, each one colder, emptier, heavier than the last. A slow march into a darkness that swallowed everything I'd ever known. A descent I couldn't stop, couldn't escape, couldn't outrun. Arctura withered beneath me. The crops shriveled into husks, brittle and grey, snapping under the lightest touch like bones too fragile to hold. The artificial suns buzzed their last, sputtering out like candles drowned in wax, their light fading into a gloom that matched my heart, leaving the fields dark and lifeless, a graveyard of what once grew, and the sky turned to a near-perfect black, save for a few stubborn stars that flickered like dying hopes against the suffocating dark, their glow too weak to offer comfort, too faint to light the path ahead, too distant to feel like anything but a taunt. The settlement faded, people vanishing into the depths of the planet's crust, their footsteps muffled as they burrowed like rats fleeing a sinking ship, their voices echoing faintly as they descended into the shadows, their tools clanging a mournful tune, or scattering into the dust, chasing rumors of light beyond the horizon, their shadows swallowed by the wind, their hope a flicker I couldn't follow, a spark I couldn't feel. I was one of the last on the surface, a solitary figure in a landscape of ruin, my shadow long and thin against the cracked ground, my presence a ghost among the ashes. A whisper in a world that had forgotten how to speak. A remnant of a life that no longer existed. I was 25, my body lean and weathered by hunger and labor, my hands rough and scarred from endless repairs, my nails chipped and dirty, my skin taut over bones that ached with every move, my eyes hollow with a grief that never left, my spirit frayed to threads but still unbroken, still clinging to the promise I'd made, a vow that anchored me when the world slipped away, a tether to a man who'd believed when no one else did, who'd seen me when I couldn't see myself. The dish was my companion, its hum a constant in the silence, a fragile thread tying me to father, to something bigger than the desolation that surrounded me, a reminder of the man who'd held on to hope even as it slipped through his fingers, who'd given me a purpose when I had none, who'd loved me enough to leave me this. I'd broadcast every night, pouring my soul into the static, tales of a girl who once chased shadows in a valley that wasn't yet ash, who'd giggled as her father spun her under a sky that still had light. Her laughter a sound I could barely remember, a faint echo in the back of my mind that faded with every year, of a man who saw beauty in a universe that had forgotten us, who'd held me when I was small and told me I was his star, whose voice I'd give anything to hear one more time, just once. Just for a moment, just to tell him I'd kept my promise. I didn't expect an answer. Hope had bled out with the stars, trickling away like water from a cracked cup, leaving me dry and hollow, a vessel emptied of everything but memory, a shell carrying a grief that never eased, but the act of speaking, of sending my voice into the void, kept me from breaking entirely. Kept me from becoming the dust I walked on, a shadow lost to the wind that howled through the ruins, a nothing in a world of nothing. Then, one night, everything changed, shifted, cracked open, brought me to my knees with a force I couldn't withstand. A sound that broke the silence I'd lived in for so long. I was mid-sentence. He used to say the stars were our family, watching over us. Even when we couldn't see them, even when they faded, even when they left us, when the static twitched, a sharp crackle slicing through the monotony like a knife through flesh, a sound that stopped my breath, froze the air in my lungs, jolted me upright. Then a voice, faint but alive, piercing the silence, cutting through the haze of my loneliness, shattering the walls I'd built around my heart, breaking through the grief that had held me captive. Elara, it said, clear as a bell, a sound that stopped my heart, froze the tears on my cheeks, sent a jolt through me that I felt in my bones, in my soul, in the marrow of who I was. This is Taryn, from Calix. We hear you? Shahzaman Iqbal, February 24, 2025, 7:37 a.m. My breath caught. My chest tightening, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst through, a wild, frantic rhythm that drowned out the hum, that shook me to my core, that woke me from the numbness I'd lived in. I stared at the console, my hands frozen on the controls, my mind reeling, afraid it was a dream, a cruel trick conjured by my loneliness, a ghost born of too many nights alone with nothing but my grief. A hallucination born of a mind stretched too thin, a heart too broken to trust. Calix, a name from father's star charts. A planet he'd circled in faded ink with a note scribbled beside it, possible signal origin. 47 light years, a distant speck in a cosmos I'd never touch. A world he'd spoken of with a glimmer of hope I hadn't understood until this moment. A possibility he'd clung to even as the sky emptied above us. A dream he'd left me to carry. I fumbled with the dials, my fingers clumsy with shock, slippery with the sweat of my palms, amplifying the signal as my voice trembled, barely a whisper, thick with disbelief and a longing I couldn't contain, a need that clawed at me from the inside, that tore through the walls I'd built. Taryn, I said, the word catching in my throat, a sob threatening to break free. My voice shaking as if it might shatter under the weight of what I felt, under the hope I didn't dare let in. Is this real? A pause stretched into an eternity, an agonizing silence that clawed at me, tore at the fragile threads of my composure, ripped at the hope I'd buried deep under layers of pain. Then a laugh, warm, rough, a sound that reached into my chest and wrapped around my heart, holding tight, pulling me back from the edge I'd teetered on for years. A sound that broke me open and held me together all at once. "As real as you are, Elara," he said, his voice young like mine, heavy with fatigue but alive with something I'd forgotten. Connection. A spark of life in the dark that lit a fire I thought had died with father. A warmth that seeped into the cold places inside me, that banished the chill I'd lived with for so long. I pressed the headset closer, my hands shaking, my breath hitching, greedy for every syllable, every breath, every trace of him, my fingers trembling as I adjusted the volume, desperate to hear him clearer, to hold on to him, to make him real. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice cracking, tears welling unbidden, spilling over as I clung to the sound of him, my chest tight with a flood of emotion I couldn't name. Relief, fear, hope, grief, love, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't unravel. "Kelix," he replied, steady despite the distance, his words a lifeline across the void, a thread pulling me from the abyss I'd fallen into. "Far from you, but close enough to hear your voice, to find you in the dark, to know you're there." Over days, then weeks, we talked, our voices threading through the void like a lifeline, fragile but unbroken, stitching us together across a darkness neither of us could cross. A bridge built of words and whispers that held me when I thought I'd fall, that gave me something to hold on to when I'd thought I'd lost it all. A connection that pulled me from the silence I'd drowned in. Taryn became my dawn in a night that refused to end. A light I hadn't known I needed until it found me, piercing the shadows I'd lived in for 9 long, lonely years. A warmth that thawed the ice that had settled in my bones, that melted the frost around my heart. His voice was my sanctuary, sometimes teasing, poking at my stubborn fixes with a grin I could hear through the static. A playful lilt that made me smile despite the ache in my chest. A sound that pulled me from the depths of my despair, that reminded me I could still feel joy, sometimes soft, sharing fears he'd buried deep. His words trembling with a vulnerability that mirrored my own, a fragility that bound us tighter than steel, a trust that grew in the spaces between us, a bond forged in the quiet moments. "You've got a fire in you," he'd say when I'd curse a broken relay, my frustration spilling over into the mic, my voice tight with exhaustion, my hands slamming the console in a futile rage against a world that wouldn't bend, that wouldn't give me a break. Good thing, too, or we'd never have found you, never heard you through the noise, never known you were out there. I'd smile, alone in the dark, my lips trembling as I shot back, "You're one to talk. Mister, I'll make this work with scrap and prayers." My voice lighter than it had been since father's death. A flicker of the girl I'd been before the storm, a spark he coaxed back to life with every word, every laugh, every gentle tease. We shared everything, memories of homes we'd lost to the fade, dreams of a sky that didn't fade into nothing, laughter that pushed against the crushing weight of our worlds, a sound I hadn't known I could still make until he drew it out of me, a joy that felt foreign and precious all at once, a gift I hadn't known I could still receive. "I wish I could see you," he said one night, his voice so quiet it broke me. A whisper that carried an ache I felt in my bones, a longing that echoed my own, that tore at the walls I'd built to keep the pain at bay, that laid me bare. "Me too," I replied, my throat tight, tears slipping down my cheeks to drip onto the console, my heart clenching with a need I couldn't name, a pull that tore at me, that made me ache for a closeness the distance wouldn't allow, that made me yearn for a touch I couldn't have. Love grew there, in the crackle of our transmissions, a slow, searing flame that burned through the loneliness I'd carried for so long, a warmth that filled the hollow where father's voice had been, a light that pushed back the dark that had swallowed me whole, a fire that raged against the cold. We never said it outright, Words like love felt too vast, too delicate for the fragile thread that bound us, too heavy for the static that carried them across the void, too big for the silence that threatened to steal them. But it lived in every silence, every stay safe, every moment we held our breath waiting for the other to reply, afraid the connection might snap, that the dark might take him too, that I'd lose another piece of my heart to the fade, that I'd be left alone again with nothing but echoes. He was my mirror, my strength, a piece of my soul I hadn't known was missing until his voice filled the empty spaces, until his presence stitched me back together when I thought I'd unravel completely, a lifeline I clung to with every fiber of my being, a savior I hadn't dared to hope for. But the universe doesn't kneel to love. Not ours, not anyone's, not even the fiercest hearts beating against its cold, indifferent expanse. Not even the souls that refuse to break. Arctura's core began to tremble, quakes rippling through the crust with a low, ominous growl that shook the ground beneath my feet, splitting it open in jagged scars that bled dust, cracking the dome's frail walls with every shudder, sending dust cascading from the ceiling like a mournful rain, a dirge for a planet dying in slow, agonizing throes, a death knell I couldn't silence. Calyx, Taryn told me, was breaking too. Volcanoes waking after centuries of sleep, their molten fury erupting into skies choked with ash that blotted out their fracturing moons. A mirror to the chaos swallowing my world, a twin collapse that bound us in our shared ruin, a shared fight against the end. Our talks turned frantic, fear bleeding through the static. Our voices trembling with a desperation we couldn't hide, a terror that clawed at the fragile hope we'd built, that threatened to tear it apart, to leave us with nothing but the wreckage. "We're building a ship," he said one night, his tone raw with determination, cutting through the haze of panic that gripped me, his words sharp and urgent. A lifeline thrown into the storm that raged around us. A small one, just enough to reach you. "Hold on, Elara. Please, hold on, don't give up now." I laughed, a sob catching in my throat, hope warring with disbelief. My hands clutching the headset as if I could pull him closer, as if I could will him through the void, my fingers trembling with the force of my grip, my nails digging into my palms. "You're insane," I said, tears streaming down my face, my voice shaking with a mix of terror and awe, my heart pounding with the impossibility of it, with the wild, reckless beauty of his vow, with the love that burned through me at his words. "For you," he replied, fierce and tender, his words a vow that sank into me like an anchor, rooting me to him across the light years, a promise that burned through the fear that held me when I thought I'd break. Yes, I clung to that promise, picturing him, someone I'd never seen, a stranger who'd become my everything, hammering steel with hands I imagined were strong and sure, plotting a course through a cosmos that was falling apart. His resolve a beacon I held onto when the dark pressed in, a light I followed when the shadows grew too thick, a star I chased when mine had all faded. "Don't you dare die," I'd say, my voice breaking, my chest tight with dread, my fingers gripping the mic until my knuckles whitened, my breath hitching with every word, my eyes burning with tears I couldn't stop, and he'd answer, "Not without you." A promise that carried me through the endless nights. A lifeline I gripped with bleeding fingers. A vow that kept me breathing when the air grew thin, when the world trembled beneath me, when the silence threatened to take him too. Months later, our sun flared, a final, furious roar that scorched the surface. A blinding light that seared my eyes even through the dome's cracked walls, melted the dish's outer panels into twisted, blackened husks, their edges glowing with a heat that mocked me, turning the valley into a sea of cracked, smoking glass that shimmered with a cruel, mocking beauty, a graveyard of everything I'd known, a mirror to the ruin inside me. I dragged the console underground, into a bunker beneath the dome, my arms aching as I hauled it down crumbling stairs, my body trembling with exhaustion, my hands scraped raw, my fingers bleeding. Jury-rigging power from a failing generator that coughed and whined with every turn. Its hum a dying gasp that echoed my own faltering strength, my own fading will. Terran's updates crackled through, each one a thread keeping me alive. A pulse in the silence that wrapped around me like a shroud. We've launched. Elara, me and 3 others, a crew of dreamers who believe in you, who heard your voice and couldn't let it go, who won't let you fade. We're past the nebula, halfway now, hold on, we're coming for you, we're so close. Then, silence, days of it, stretching into a void deeper than the sky. A silence that swallowed me whole, that sank into my bones like ice, that froze the air in my lungs, that choked me with its weight. I'd scream into the mic, Terran, please, answer me, my voice hoarse. My hands slamming the console in desperation, my cries echoing in the bunker, bouncing off the walls, a sound of raw, unfiltered panic that tore at me. But the static stared back, cold and unyielding, mocking my pleas with its emptiness, laughing at my hope with its silence, taunting me with the loss I feared. The bunker turned frigid, the air thick with dust that stung my lungs, coated my throat, choked me with every breath, food dwindling to crumbs I forced down with shaking hands, my body weakening as my spirit frayed, my eyes burning with unshed tears, my skin cold to the touch, my heart slowing with every beat. Despair clawed at me, whispering he was gone, lost to a flare, a crash, 1,000 fates I couldn't fight, his ship a wreck drifting in the dark, his voice silenced forever, another loss I couldn't survive, another wound I couldn't bear. But I kept broadcasting, my voice a ragged, tear-soaked plea, my hands trembling on the mic as I spoke into the emptiness, my words a lifeline I couldn't let go, a cry that kept me tethered when I wanted to let go, when I wanted to fall. This is Elara of Arctura. If you're out there, Terran, I'm still here. I'm waiting. Don't leave me. Please, don't leave me too. Not you. Not now. Not after everything. It was all I had left, his promise, my stubborn refusal to let him fade. A cry that echoed in my chest even as my strength ebbed, even as the world shook around me, even as the dark closed in with its cold, unyielding hands. Shazam and Iqbal, February 24, 2025, 7:37 a.m. Time blurred in that tomb. Days, weeks, perhaps months, the generator flickering, its hum growing faint, a heartbeat slowing to a stop, the walls cracking under quakes that grew fiercer each day, their rumbles a dirge for a planet dying beneath me, a requiem for a world I couldn't save, a song of loss I knew too well. I was a ghost, my body frail, my skin cold, my spirit fraying at the edges, my voice reduced to a whisper as I clung to the mic, choking out, I'm still here, my lips chapped and bleeding, my throat raw, my tears long since dried into salt on my cheeks, my eyes hollow with exhaustion, my body a shell holding a soul that barely held on. The end came fast, a quake that split the bunker's wall with a deafening crack, dust choking me, the console sparking its last as the power died, plunging me into darkness, a black so complete it felt like death, a shroud that wrapped around me and squeezed until I couldn't breathe, until I thought I'd vanish into it. I thought it was over, Arctura's core giving out, ready to bury me in its ruins, my promise to father unfulfilled, my hope for Terran snuffed out like the stars I'd lost. My life ending in a silence I couldn't break, a darkness I couldn't fight. Then, a hum, not the dish, but above, a sound that vibrated through the ground, through my bones, pulling me from the brink, a pulse that stirred the air, that shook me awake, that dragged me back from the edge. I stumbled outside, my legs buckling beneath me, my hands clawing at the hatch, my body weak, into a wasteland of ash and ruin, my eyes burning in the haze, my breath ragged, my chest heaving with sobs I couldn't hold back, a sound that tore from me like a wound reopening, like a cry I'd held in for years. A light pierced the black sky, a ship, small and battered, its hull glowing faintly with a golden warmth as it descended through the choking dust. A beacon in the chaos, a miracle I didn't dare believe, a hope I'd thought was lost. I crawled toward it, my knees scraping the ground, sobs tearing from my chest, my hands reaching out, hope a fragile thread pulling me forward through the pain, through the despair that had nearly claimed me, through the years of loneliness that had carved me hollow, through the grief that had defined me. The hatch hissed open, and there he was, Taran, tall and lean, his hair wild, tangled with ash, his eyes like a storm over a sea I'd never seen, alive and real, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his breath hitching as he saw me, as he took me in, as he realized I was still here. "I told you I'd come," he said, his voice breaking, raw with exhaustion and relief, a sound that shattered me as he ran to me, dropping to his knees in the ash beside me, his hands reaching for me, trembling as they found me. I reached for him, my hands shaking, my vision blurring with tears, my fingers brushing his face, warm, solid, here, and we collided, arms locking tight, his warmth flooding through me as I sobbed into his shoulder, my fingers digging into his back as if he might vanish, as if the universe might steal him too, my cries muffled against his chest, a sound of relief and grief and love all tangled together, a release of everything I'd held in. He was here, my miracle, my heartbeat, the answer to every prayer I'd whispered into the dark, the promise kept when I'd thought all promises were lost, the light I'd clung to when the world went dark, the love that saved me when I couldn't save myself. We had no time to savor it. No moment to breathe in the reality of each other, to let the truth of his presence sink into the cracks of my broken heart, to heal the wounds we carried. The ground heaved beneath us, fissures racing outward like veins of fire, Arctura's death throes shaking the air with a roar that drowned my cries, a sound that vibrated through my chest, my bones, a force that threatened to tear us apart before we'd even begun. A cruel twist of fate I couldn't fight. The ship was a patchwork of dents and welds, its engines sputtering like a wounded beast, coughing smoke and sparks into the ash-laden air. A fragile thing that held our lives in its trembling frame, but we scrambled inside. My legs weak, my body trembling, his arm around me, holding me up as we staggered to the seats, strapping in with hands that shook, belts rattling against the frame, our breaths hitching in unison, our hearts pounding as one. "Hold on," Taran said, his hands flying over the controls, his jaw tight with resolve, his voice steady despite the tremor in it, his eyes flicking to me with a fierceness that anchored me, a look that said we'd make it, that he wouldn't let go, that we'd survive this together. I gripped his arm, my nails digging into his skin, my breath hitching, my eyes locked on the viewport as my world, father's world, fell apart before me. A collapse I couldn't stop, a loss I couldn't fight, a goodbye I couldn't speak. The dome crumpled like paper, folding in on itself with a groan that echoed in my soul, a sound that tore at me. The dish toppled into the dust with a final, mournful crash that reverberated through me, a sound that broke me anew, that carried the weight of every memory, and the valley vanished in a storm of ash and debris, a grey shroud swallowing everything I'd ever known, every trace of the life I'd fought to hold onto, every piece of father I'd kept alive, every fragment of the girl I'd been. We launched, the ship shuddering violently, a trail of sparks and smoke streaming behind us as Arctura shattered below, its pieces scattering into the void. A planet reduced to rubble, to nothing. A home lost forever, a past I couldn't reclaim. Tears streamed down my face, a keening wail escaping me, raw and unstoppable. My chest aching with the loss of father, of home, of the promise I'd kept until it broke me. My hands clawing at the seat as the sobs tore through me. A sound of grief and rage and love all tangled together, a cry that carried years of pain, of longing, of survival against the odds, a scream that echoed everything I'd lost and everything I'd found. Taran's hand found mine, his fingers threading through, steady and fierce. His grip an anchor in the chaos, his warmth a lifeline pulling me back from the edge. His touch a promise that I wasn't alone, not anymore, that we'd face this together. We'll find somewhere, he said, his voice a vow through gritted teeth, his eyes meeting mine with a fire that burned through the tears. A determination that held me when I thought I'd fall apart, a strength that matched my own, a love that mirrored mine. Together, the stars were scant, the fade a suffocating shroud closing in, a darkness that pressed against the hull, that whispered of an end we couldn't escape, that threatened to swallow us whole. But we flew into it, the console still humming faintly, sending our last signal into the void as the ship carried us forward, away from the wreckage, into the unknown, into a future we'd carve from the ashes, a future we'd fight for. This is Alara and Taryn, we said, our voices entwined, trembling with grief and defiance, thick with the weight of what we'd lost and the fragile, desperate hope we'd found in each other, a sound that carried our pain, our love, our fight, our everything. We're still here, we're still alive. The universe might end, might swallow us whole, might grind us to dust in its relentless jaws, but we'd fight, for every second, every tear, every fragile, blazing moment we'd stolen from the dark, our hands clasped tight, our hearts beating as one against the silence, a signal that refused to fade, a cry that echoed into the void long after we were gone, a testament to a love that defied the end, that burned brighter than the stars we'd lost, that lived when everything else died.